Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. Now, you may have noticed we don't have comments on for this show. That's because one of our stories tonight concerns crimes of sexual abuse against children. Under the law, victims of sexual assault have a lifelong right to anonymity. To break that anonymity is a criminal offence. It's also obviously a moral offence. After all, we're talking about the innocent victims of horrific crimes. So for that reason, to avoid any speculation in the comments, we have turned them off for tonight. Coming up tonight, the Prime Minister has announced a £15 billion increase in military spending to be funded by cutting investment budgets in other areas. Anti-immigrant protests are sweeping South Africa. Former DUP leader Jeffrey Donaldson has been found guilty of child sex abuse. And we look into the so-called anti-woke Davos taking aim at UK net zero policies. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Barry Malone. Barry, welcome.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you. Always enjoy being paired with you. It happens only occasionally, but it's always good when it does.
Too infrequently, I think. Before we get started, please note tomorrow's show will start at 7:30 p.m. That's because tomorrow's Novara Live team will be watching England play against the Democratic Republic of Congo at the World Cup. And we suspect that much of our audience might be as well. So why not just start a little bit later so we can all enjoy it? We think that'll be around 7:30, could be a little bit later depending on how things go. But do not forget to tune in after the match. Let's go to our first story. Defence and the question of how much we spend on it has been a politically tricky question for outgoing Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Just days before the Makefield by-election, that sealed Starmer's fate. Then Defence Secretary John Healey dramatically quit his post after he accused the government of not taking defence spending seriously enough. The issue was the much-delayed Defence Investment Plan, a roadmap to increase defence spending over the rest of this Parliament. And Healey was particularly annoyed that drafts he's seen didn't appear to push the UK towards spending 3% of GDP on defence in the next 3 years. Well, Starmer has today published that defence plan and presented it at a Downing Street press conference.
We are already delivering the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the 1980s, £270 billion over the spending review period. And I can announce today that under the Defence Investment Plan, we are increasing this by a further £15 billion, setting a new record of spending almost £300 billion over the next 4 years to back our armed forces and strengthen our national security.
£15 billion is, in my mind, quite a lot of money, but John Healey was not impressed by that extra spending, posting this online. Today is the next down payment for defence. It builds on the record defence investment Labour and government has already made. But Britain will still be spending just 2.7% of GDP in 2030, the date when NATO has warned we could face a Russian attack. European security is at stake. The PM has said today that 3% must be the number one priority for the next spending review. We need a target date for 3% and a clear, credible funding plan to meet our NATO commitment for 3.5% on defence by 2035. As I said, 15 billion extra pounds in this economy still feels like a lot of money, but where's it coming from?
It delivers the decisive action we need on defence in a way that is within our fiscal rules and that will not take resources away from day-to-day spending on frontline services like health and education. Instead, it is funded by reallocating spending from across government departments, reallocating capital budgets by 1 penny in every pound, while still maintaining public investment at the highest sustained levels since the 1970s. It means departments making better use of assets, like underused land. And it means those departments with the largest capital budgets contributing more. Therefore, some capital projects, for example on roads and energy, which are important but not immediately vital, will no longer go ahead as planned.
Now, recently, some of those said to be advising Andy Burnham have published their ideas on how to raise money for defence spending. In a Financial Times piece last month, former chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, proposed issuing defence bonds to British savers, taking a leaf out of the 1940 war financing plan of economist John Maynard Keynes. But in his speech, Keir Starmer was clear that he was not keen on that idea.
You also have those who say you can fund defence without making sacrifices in other areas of capital spending. And you have those arguing that we can just raise borrowing, put it all on the never-never. But let's be clear, defence bonds are just borrowing by another name. We've looked at this very carefully. But the fact is, doing this through borrowing would push interest rates higher at a time when £1 in every 10 already goes on paying debt interest. And this government has fought hard to bring the public finances under control. And it has paid off, helping to bring inflation and mortgage rates down. We should not sacrifice that now.
I mean, that looks more than anything like a piece of politics to me, just sort of reminding the nation that, it was Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves who are responsible for our financial security. They weren't Liz Truss. That was a very low bar they set for themselves. And the shot across the bows of Andy Burnham's economic advisors, who may be thinking a little bit more creatively about how the fiscal rules can be kept while still allowing more borrowing using particular kinds of financial vehicles, which is probably, at least an idea worth considering, I'd have thought. But it seems Starmer's made up his mind. Khem Rogaly is co-director of Transition Security Project, founded by Commonwealth and the Climate and Community Institute. It investigates the economic, climate, and geopolitical impacts of militarism in the US and UK. So who better to ask than Khem whether the row over 2.7 versus 3% of GDP really has anything to do with keeping us safer?
It's complete nonsense. What we're seeing is that there's a constant way of making military policy decisions based on these percentage of GDP figures, which are completely arbitrary. And I think it's really important for us to understand what the percentage of GDP figures actually mean. It means that rather than thinking, okay, this is the amount of military resources and capacity that we need to keep a country safe or to defend a country, that we are making these decisions based off just the percentage of national income that we're going to spend on our military budget every year. And the reason that the budgets are made like this and that you don't see this done on health, on education, on climate policy is basically because they want to hide the actual amount of money that's being spent. They don't want to have to justify the amount of money that's being spent. And what you end up with is these huge choices made by governments. And we've seen basically a raid across the board of other government departments today being made to fulfill a completely arbitrary target. And the most perverse of these arbitrary targets is the 3.5% of GDP target that we're being set by 2035, which is basically just a copy of the percentage of GDP that the US spends on its military. And what the White House has done has said to European NATO members, you have to go and spend the same. So what we're seeing is hundreds of billions of pounds. It will be trillions of euros across Europe that end up being spent to fulfill a completely arbitrary target that has really nothing to do with security at all.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the arbitrariness of the target. And maybe I'm going to come to those cuts to other projects that were made in order to do this 15 billion increase in spending today. But I've never understood the share of GDP question, right? I mean, it's not like, and we should be wary of comparing, budgeting to like household budgets. But, it's not like anyone thinks the best way to secure your house is to use a percentage of your income in order to do it, rather than looking at what kit you need depending on where you live, which is how people would normally do that kind of thing. So, I mean, where does it come from? I mean, you said they use it because they want to sort of conceal the actual raw figures spent on defense. And I think committing a percentage of GDP, it can almost make it look like defense is a kind of like nationalized industry that needs to be constantly propped up. Obviously, it's not just soldiers who are receiving that money, right? It's private arms manufacturers, a larger military industrial complex. So is there any way of making sense of this share of GDP measure for what we spend on military?
So it comes from NATO. So NATO originally started using this to force their member states to meet a 2% of GDP target, which Britain was always above. And the reason that they did that was to hide the amount of money that was needed for capability, for what militaries actually needed to do. And it also served a really convenient purpose for NATO that we've seen throughout these so-called debates, which is that basically allowed countries to talk about there being a peace dividend and the fact that we kind of saved lots of money during this peace dividend and now we can finally rearm and invest in our military. And the reason the percent of GDP target relates to that is because if you look at British military spending, we have a larger budget now in real terms than we did in 1980. kind of high point of the Cold War. It's larger than it was in 1990 as well. But it's smaller as a share of the overall economy. It's smaller as a share of GDP. So if you put it in these GDP terms, it makes it seem like our military spending has gone down, when in actual fact it's gone up. So it's basically a very effective way of both lobbying for more military spending and for hiding military spending. And what we've seen in the last few days is that after these incessant and relentless attacks from kind of different components of the military establishment, lobbying the government to commit this extra money, which they've now done, to the military budget, is they're now saying, can you bring forward a certain date in which we'll meet a percentage of GDP target? Because that's a great new step to get more and more money.
So that's about spending. Another way in which the military seems really different from other government departments, or the defense ministry from other government departments, is it's almost like it's the job of the defense secretary to constantly ask for more money, and then you see at various points, it's almost like there's a little gang of like senior military leaders who'll write letters to the newspapers insisting that we're about to hit a crisis, or we need to do conscription if we don't get more money, this kind of thing. But you never see any of them talk about efficiencies or savings like you do in other departments. Is that just my imagination, or does that hold?
It's absolutely exhausting, Stephen, if you work in this area, because you're constantly buffeted by these news stories that you get. Admiral Tony Radakin says that future prime ministers must pass the Moscow test, or you get these kind of anonymous sources that are constantly briefing every newspaper saying we need X amount of money to fund Y. And actually this whole John Healey resignation, it's almost kind of darkly comical in some ways, because what happened was they agreed an amount of money last year at the spending review, which massively increased the military budget. And then they decided to brief the press anonymously that they had this so-called shortfall at the Ministry of Defence without ever publishing any evidence to support the fact that there is this shortfall. And because they created this idea of the shortfall, and then the lobbying didn't end up being fully successful, you end up with the Defence Secretary resigning. So it's really a bizarre and crazy way of making policy. And actually, if you look at the question of waste, it's absolutely astonishing. So even just off the Ministry of Defence's own data this year, the amount of waste in its budget last year, plus the amount that it estimates it's at risk of fraud for, so that's fraud coming from these private contractors in the contracts, is almost as much as it's increasing the budget by in this additional spending for the Defence Investment Plan. It's about 3 billion just in waste and fraud every year in the military budget. And then if you add on top of that, you can look at how inefficient our military spending is. Not that I think that we should have the kind of extensive nuclear arsenal that France does, but we're spending billions of pounds more a year on nuclear weapons than France are. And our nuclear weapons don't work. They're completely reliant on the US. And France has a wider range of military options and an independent nuclear arsenal. Not saying that is the kind of horizon that we should be looking towards, but it just shows how much money is wasted here and ultimately how much corruption there is in the system.
So there was this big strategic review last year, I think, right? What was waste, corruption, any of that dealt with in that review in terms of thinking about the direction of the military? And if it wasn't, is this just like a political issue that no prime minister or chancellor is prepared to tackle savings to be found to pay for military investment?
Well, what they will do is talk about waste and talk about problems in the procurement system, but they'll do that in order to campaign for more spending. So they'll say there are these problems in the procurement system. You have the famous example of the Ajax tank, for instance, which doesn't work, is nearly a decade delayed, even though it's cost about £6 billion in the end, has injured the personnel who are testing it. That's often brought up within the military establishment, but they use it as a way of getting more money. So what you don't see at moments like the Strategic Defence Review is an acknowledgement of the waste within the system as an acknowledgement of, actually, we need to prioritise this budget and spend it differently. Instead, you just have the constant and endless lobbying for more and more money at the Ministry of Defence.
Okay, so sort of entrenched culture here of just, expecting the magic money tree to always shake for bombs. But also sacrifices being made elsewhere in order to satisfy those whims. So we saw today there's going to be cuts to energy and infrastructure projects in order to fund this extra 15 billion. Do you know anything about those cuts? And I'm sure you've got something to say about the wisdom of that kind of way of, squeezing the toothpaste around the tube.
Absolutely. So it's luxury for the MOD and austerity for everyone else. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is those cuts are targeted at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and at the Department for Transport. There isn't transparency, and there's unlikely to be transparency over exactly what the projects are that are being cut. But over the next 4 years, we're seeing about £2 billion cut from the Energy Security and Net Zero budget. We're going to see about £1 billion cut from the Department for Transport. And that's on top of a couple of billion. I think it might be slightly different. They've only just released the data that's being cut from all government departments' capital investment budget. So that is infrastructure spending by every other government department apart from the Ministry of Defence. And to put that in context, today we're hearing about crisis in maternity care in the NHS, and infrastructure spending in the NHS is about fixing hospitals. It's about having functioning air conditioning for people who work in the NHS. All of these things which we know are big problems for the health service, and yet those budgets will be cut as well. Infrastructure in schools, that gets cut. And all of that is just to fund these arbitrary spending targets at the Ministry of Defence. And one thing that I actually want to raise there, because I think it's really important to get this message across to the audience, is that we are constantly told that we need this money for security to keep ourselves safe. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what the British military is. We have a global military with the 6th largest budget in the world, that in that strategic defence review last year outlined a strategy that, yes, it includes some role for national security and national defence, but also includes what they call shaping the global security environment, projecting power overseas. They're still talking about this ridiculous Hormuz mission that's never going to happen. We were bombing Yemen for 2 years under this Labour, or nearly 2 years under this Labour government, and the Tory government before it. We obviously flying spy flights over Gaza during the genocide, and maintaining a complex of bases that stretch from the Indian Ocean to the South Atlantic. We are not talking about defending the country. We are talking about trying to be a great military power. And when you see these cuts to other parts of the public sector being used to fund this kind of geopolitical game playing and posturing, it's really sickening, because people in this country are going to suffer from the fact that we have military officials and a military establishment that cares about juicing its budget and projecting its force overseas.
That's what makes the cut to net zero and energy projects particularly sort of sickening, because, over the last, how many years are now? 4 years, the 2 times that there have looked like there would be very detrimental effects on ordinary people, on the economy, have both involved energy insecurity. There was, the energy hit from Ukraine and the threatened energy hit from Hormuz. And you'd think that a genuine security plan would be one that involved, securing our own clean energy supplies so that we're not affected ourselves. We're kept secure as citizens of the country economically from the impacts of these wars.
Exactly. And it's actually very interesting to reflect on what's happened in the years since the Ukraine invasion, and then also in the post-Iran war moment of energy shocks, which is that actually after 2022, what you saw is the EU and UK didn't go for a strategy of investing in renewables. They basically went for a strategy with 2 pillars. One was to replace Russian gas with more expensive and also polluting American liquefied natural gas. And the other was to prioritize military investment. And they prioritized it over the climate transition. So over that period, what ended up happening is we, households paying energy bills in Europe, ended up bearing that additional cost. We've done research on this at Transition Security Project, found that the additional costs borne by European governments and households were about 1.8 trillion euros over that period. About $200 billion in that time also flowed in profits to American energy companies because we were increasing our supplies of liquefied natural gas. And I think what's interesting is you kind of get this picture from the military establishment that there's no alternative. But actually, there was a country at the same time that equally, like Europe, doesn't have huge domestic fossil fuel supplies, that took a different and policy strategy. Obviously, it's kind of relates differently to the war in Ukraine specifically, but just as a kind of different policy pathway, what you saw is that China, over that same period, invested less in its military, both in real terms and as a share of GDP, and more in the climate transition over those years from 2022 to 2025. And actually what we've seen is that countries that invested more in the climate transition in that period, including some countries in Europe, have been much more resilient to this latest energy shock than countries like the UK, which have been really badly exposed, and we're left footing the bill. So all of these kind of militarism, this posturing, this allegiance to the US above everything, which is kind of at the core of those strategic choices, leaves us as people living in this country footing the bill.
Let me ask you about the future. Obviously, Keir Starmer, who was speaking today, is out the door. Andy Burnham on his way in. I noticed Andy Haldane, former Bank of England chief economist, is one of the advisors, or said to be one of the advisors on Burnham's team. He recently published an article in the FT where he was talking about issuing defence bonds, sort of Keynesian idea from Keynes's 1940s war plan. That's an alternative model of borrowing, which Keir Starmer dismissed outright in his speech today. Obviously, you would rather see spending on the military reduced, but if you did have to borrow, what do you make of that idea of a different kind of borrowing mechanism?
Well, I think we have to think about the opportunity cost. So what we're seeing is we have these very, very strict fiscal rules which are restricting public investment across the board, and then this idea that you might do something a bit like what Germany have done, which is to kind of remove restrictions on borrowing to fund greater military investment. And unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately because I don't want this to happen, but unfortunately in terms of what the impacts might be, military spending compared to other forms of public spending is very bad for the economy. So if you're borrowing just to pay for military spending at the cost of spending on sectors like green energy, like public services, health, transport, housing, education, you're going to create fewer jobs, you're going to create less growth. And actually that kind of risks stagnating the economy, it risks job losses, which is what we're going to see ultimately from this defence investment plan, but because you're creating very few jobs with the new military spending and you're cutting spending elsewhere. So it's basically a very poor way to manage the economy, and something that would have a kind of a negative impact in the long run, even if they did it in this way of borrowing, but kind of only for the military sector.
In your reading of the economic, political tea leaves, have you seen any sense of a change of direction over military spending from the Burnham camp?
I mean, I hope that just by looking at the flaws of this strategy and kind of, as I've just very briefly alluded to there, the fact that we probably are going to see job losses as a result of this defence investment plan, you would hope that Andy Burnham will be sensible enough to think that they should be kind of pursuing a much more balanced strategy for the economy that includes thinking about our energy security, housing, transport, all of these things that he professes to care about. Really, of course, and overall prioritising the cost of living as the number one concern. However, I wouldn't say that I'm hugely optimistic that they're going to take that path. There's been a lot of briefing to the press, especially from the kind of Labour right type allies of Andy Burnham, that he's committed to funding military spending increases. He's also said that himself that he's kind of thinking about cutting welfare as a way of funding increased military spending. So I'm not hugely optimistic that there is going to be a different path. And it seems like what he's kind of looking at is outsourcing his foreign policy to the right wing of the Labour Party. He's spoken more about the fact that he's interested in domestic policy over foreign policy, but I think what he kind of means by that is he wants someone like David Miliband to come in potentially as foreign secretary. He's keeping Jonathan Powell as national security advisor. So figures like that who can kind of keep this relationship, which really is, keep this policy, which really predominantly is about the relationship between our country and the US, and mostly about following US demands. And maybe that's something that we need to look at as well from the defence investment plan, because while on the one hand we're buying more F-35s from the US to carry US-owned nuclear weapons that will all be housed in this country, we're seeing a simultaneous investment that was published in The Guardian today from the US into UK bases that they're going to have in the UK, including the housing of nuclear weapons. So that kind of binding of our foreign policy to US objectives looks set to continue. And as much as I would hope that Burnham would change that, I'm not too sure that he will, based on what's kind of been briefed to the press already.
That was Khem Rogaly speaking to me earlier today. Let's go on to our next story. Thousands of protesters have joined anti-immigrant demonstrations in cities across South Africa today. Police enlisted private security contractors to help contain the demonstrations, while businesses were forced to close. Protesters, like the one seen here in Johannesburg, carried traditional fighting sticks. Far-right groups had given undocumented migrants until today to flee the country. But those edicts were rejected by the country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who reminded South Africans of this. Some foreign nationals who live in South Africa are here lawfully. They work, study, raise families, invest in our economy, and contribute positively to our society. They too are entitled to the protection of our laws and our constitution. Kind of leaves it open that other kinds of immigrants might not be entitled to protection. Yet the South African government has also fanned the flames of anti-migrant rhetoric through some of its policies. 25,000 people have been repatriated in recent months, according to the South African police, and many more people have left the country fearing violence. One man, Thomas Vincent Baloyi from Mozambique, has spent nights sleeping rough after being chased from his home in Cape Town. He told AFP this. They said, "You're a foreigner, you don't belong in South Africa, so you must go." I said, "No, I've got documents to be here in South Africa." They didn't want to know. They just chase us away like dogs. That is unfair because actually, I am a human being. According to local South African media in one town outside Johannesburg, demonstrators went door to door handing anyone they suspected of being an undocumented migrant over to the authorities. And protesters have said that the demonstrations today are just a start.
This was the beginning. So we're going to do this until they leave, until they leave, until government goes into those flats, because basfihle flatini. So we're not stupid. It's not like just a protest thing, because we're going to carry on and remove the drug dealers, and the saloons need to go back to the hands of the South Africans. They need to vacate those shops that they're operating illegally. All of these shops.
In 2008, South Africa experienced anti-immigration riots that descended into pretty extreme violence. 62 people were killed, with hundreds more injured. And many migrants also fled the country after their properties were torched. This fresh outpouring of anger against migrants comes at a time of economic crisis in the country. There's a national jobs crisis, with almost half of the country's youth suffering unemployment. There's also a cost of living crisis in the country, with groceries rising 2.3% month on month in the last year. And there's a housing crisis, with the country falling short by some 2.6 million homes, with little in the way of social housing. Barry, I believe that you've written about South Africa and this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment in your amazing Proximity Substack, also a new podcast. What do you make of what's going on in South Africa? What's your analysis?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's really extreme. Sometimes the level of violence that you see being used, and the kind of the terror that these sort of far-right demonstrators spread among the foreign community or the immigrant community in South Africa. And to be clear, it's a violence that's directed against other Africans, usually. It's not directed against white immigrants. It's all to do with sort of, other Africans who are the lowest on the ladder when it comes to, socioeconomic disadvantage, or, it's the poorest immigrants is basically what I'm saying, which we see in many other countries, right? And the thing about it is that the roots of this go back a really, really long way. Like what you just said there about 2008 spate of violence was absolutely atrocious. And some of our viewers and listeners might recall that there was a man from Mozambique who was burnt alive at one sort of demonstration, and that image flashed all over the world, and for a while people did pay attention. Then there were other bouts in 2015. There were other bouts in 2019. Now this latest sort of wave started in April. There were a bunch of new groups on the scene, also groups that weren't around in like 2015, 2019, 2008. And I think that's quite interesting because some of these groups appear pretty sinister. So the group that organizes the marches is called March and March. There's also a group sort of more behind the scenes when it comes to organizing demonstrations, which is called Operation Dudula. Now, Operation Dudula, by the way, Dudula roughly translates as push out, very roughly. And Operation Dadula started as a vigilante group, but it's now registered as a political party. So I think that's quite significant because they clearly think that there is some capital in them registering as a political party and maybe running. And then there are other far-right political parties in South Africa, Action SA and the Patriotic Alliance. So there's a lot of different groups kind of involved. And then there are kind of really interesting political elements to it as well. As your quote, I think, demonstrated there, your President Cyril Ramaphosa, that was a very mealy-mouthed warning because it almost seemed to suggest that, hey, if they're illegal, it's gloves off, right?
Do what you like. Yeah.
There are some people here who are legal, don't forget. Although the government it's kind of trodden a very thin line here where it's reacted one way then another way, because the thing about the ANC is that it has a very broad and a very diverse voter base. So there are supporters and party members who are sort of very strong on human rights, and really believe in human rights and really do want to crack down. But then there are other elements of their constituency who do have sympathies with the far right. So politically, I guess they see themselves as being in a sort of a tough position. One thing that I found really interesting that I read the other day is they're trying to almost shift the blame onto the former president, Jacob Zuma. So Zuma now leads a different political party. It's called the MK Party. And before he sort of left the ANC in disgrace, Zuma was being accused of whipping up anti-immigrant sentiment. People said that Zuma was kind of leaning deep into identity politics in order to sort of protect himself politically. So the ANC is now sort of pointing backwards and saying, okay, but it was Jacob Zuma who started this. The other thing that I wanted to point out in terms of how this is potentially going to develop, in terms of what pressure can be put on the government to get its arms around it. We've seen this, I think, remarkable thing, and this has been happening since April, where other African countries have been evacuating their own citizens from South Africa. So Nigeria repatriated a bunch of people. Ghana did it. There was a few other countries that did it too. And we're talking about people coming from a lot of different African countries, right? So primarily they come from neighboring countries. So Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho. But then they're also coming from places as far away as, like I say, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia. And when these governments are going to the lengths of evacuating their citizens out of South Africa, one of the reasons they're doing that is because they're under political pressure at home to do that. Because Nigerians are seeing, because Mozambicans are seeing what's happening in South Africa, and they're getting really, really angry about it. So what you have is this political pressure on those other African countries to put pressure on the South African government. And I can't think of any other sort of situation in the world where there's, a surge in sort of far-right violence, and the government of that country comes under diplomatic pressure from a bunch of other countries, including powerful countries such as Nigeria. So I'm kind of watching that as a sort of a key for how this develops in terms of the South African government's response.
Yeah, that is curious. I didn't know about those evacuations. I mean, one of the things I would say about South Africa is obviously it has, there are all the ingredients there for a kind of, the populist stoking up of anger. And Jacob Zuma has always been kind of a populist. Even when he was the president, he was a sort of populist president who allegedly helped himself to a lot of money. But I think there's an additional factor in South Africa, which is I think that it's been 30 years since the end of apartheid, and for many people who were treated horrifically, oppressed enormously by the state, the vast majority of South Africans in those years, there hasn't been the material transformation that I think they really hoped that there would be. I mean, South Africa remains an economic powerhouse in the continent. It's still, it's still a wealthy place comparably, but that wealth is just not in any way shared out in the way that it should be. And I think that probably is somewhere in the heart of this issue.
Definitely, all the data is there. I mean, you were talking about, there's 30% unemployment. There's youth unemployment has gone up as high as 45, 47%. But white unemployment has always stayed really low, comparatively. Even when the economy was at its worst, on its knees, white unemployment was only running at about 7 to 8%. And so there is this massive inequality. And as you say, there's still this massive racial inequality. But age-old tale, where is the anger being directed? It's being directed at even more disadvantaged people rather than where it should be directed.
Yeah. It's always tricky establishing the kind of real economic facts in somewhere like South Africa, because while there's a formal economy where, people have jobs, there's a huge informal economy as well. And actually, I was looking earlier today, migrants entering South Africa are not really occupying very many jobs in the formal economy.
Yeah.
They're occupying jobs in the informal economy, which is also where a large proportion of South Africans, black South Africans, get their work as well, is in that informal, poorer black South Africans.
Yeah, in townships, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's say on the topic of migration, it's as always a very hot topic here in the UK as well. And Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has now unveiled a raft of new measures intended to reduce the number of asylum seekers entering the country. The Immigration and Asylum Bill was announced in the King's speech earlier this year, and contained amongst its new policies is this one. Asylum seekers who are granted the right to remain in the UK will have to pay £10,000 toward their state-funded living costs if the law goes through. According to the plans, migrants working and earning a specific amount will be required to pay back a flat rate sum before being allowed to settle permanently. The Home Office hasn't yet said how much people would need to earn before making monthly instalments. So the question is, will it actually raise any cash? Madeleine Sumption, the director of the University of Oxford's Migration Observatory, said this. The data suggests that unless thresholds were significantly below the minimum wage, a relatively small share of people granted asylum would earn enough to make contributions to the scheme. Overall, the impact of the scheme on public finances is likely to be relatively small because it is a means-tested payment for a very low-income population. So no is the answer to that question of whether it will raise money, but that's probably not what it's for. And Mahmood's had another brainwave. She's also proposed that hundreds of trained members of the public should adjudicate asylum appeals cases rather than judges. The Times had these details. The Home Office said it wanted adjudicators with a broad range of skills and backgrounds, but there would be safeguards to ensure high standards. It said they would be professionally trained and independently appointed, much like magistrates, who do not need a legal background and come from all walks of life. Yeah, but magistrates don't really tend to make decisions that could completely change the course of a person's life or end up having them sent back to a country that is war-torn or a genocide is happening, for example. And you only have to go as far as LBC to begin wondering whether this would really be a good idea.
What would you seek to find out? As a case was put before you, let's say there's a 25-year-old man who's just come across the channel, is originally from Sudan. Judy, I'm afraid we have no papers for him, but he's saying that he's unwelcome in his homeland because he's under political persecution or he's homosexual or whatever it might be. What would you seek to find out?
I need to find out when the next boat is going to clear off.
The majority of these 87,400 cases, when they finally get heard, as our lawyer pointed out, they will be approved. These people will be approved to stay in this country. The majority, not all, but the majority.
But they have broken the law initially. They've come over illegally. End of. They don't actually need to go to court. They need to be just sent back and legal routes be created for them to come through into this country.
Those were not the same person, by the way.
Yeah, I was thinking, wow, Judy's all over the place.
She's really thought it through. Yeah, Barry, what do you make of these proposals? So on the one hand, you've got the £10,000 repayment before you get settled status if your asylum claim is granted. And on the other hand, you have randoms deciding appeals cases and asylum cases.
I think they're both seedy populist policies. And I think they're only about grabbing the headlines. And I'm confused by that. I'm confused by that politically. We know Shabana Mahmood has been doing this kind of thing for a long time, but a lot has happened in recent months that would suggest that Labour is not going to make the political capital it needs to make with headline-grabbing populist nonsense about immigration. Because we saw, for a long time, Labour seemed to think that the right strategy to combat reform was to become more reform than reform or out-reform reform. And then they realised that that wasn't really working, that people who like reform just like reform. And then, of course, the other thing that you do is you let reform frame the debate. We've been over this a million times. It hasn't been working for them. And the recent by-elections have shown that, right? If you look at the data, yes, Labour loses votes to reform, but it's looking like it's now losing more votes to the Greens. So here I thought that the big brains at Labour were deciding that they were going to stop cleaving right wing and that they were going to try to stop bleeding voters to the left. And now she comes out with this, or the Home Office comes out with this. And it, like, again, then the other thing that you have to wonder is, I mean, it looks like she's going to be in Burnham's cabinet. So what are they doing here?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's always this idea, even if you have relatively left-wing governments, that somehow the Home Office has to be like really tough. You need like the cop energy somewhere, and it's got to be in the Home Office, because that's the one that's in charge of keeping us all in line and managing the borders. I do think. I mean, I should say, I think also in this bill are safe and legal routes. So the opening of safe and legal routes, but again, we don't know from what countries and under what circumstances. But just this promise that there will be some.
And watch how they will never make the headlines.
What's
made the headlines today is these two things.
Yeah, exactly. These are doing precisely the political thing that you just said. They're speaking in a way to the audience that has been proved not to be the one that's going to make a difference to Labour's fortunes at this point. I don't know the one about. I mean. I guess I'm like always, sort of mad optimist, and I can sort of see like some value in both of these if they were done right. So, I actually think if people, volunteered to be on these panels, and part of their training was that they actually had to go and meet asylum seekers, they might pretty quickly change their minds when they hear the stories of people and how they've got here. So it could be a sort of education program for reform voters. I mean, it probably won't work like that. And on the repaying some of the costs of asylum. Look, I think it is our duty to take in asylum seekers and to give people refugee status to help people as, one of the very richest countries in the world. Mm-hmm. But I also, I do think that maybe there is something about the idea that actually there could be something contributory to say, a marker of your sort of becoming a part of the society that you've chosen to join, which might be somehow, I don't think it should be £10,000.
I was going to say.
Which no one will ever be able to repay, because, it's going to be not an easy life when they get here. But yeah, I don't think, I don't know. That's a silver lining kind of view. I don't think actually it would be the sort, I actually think it would be better if, there was an encouragement for people who arrive as refugees to sort of do things in their community, for example, as a way of creating that kind of social credit. That's an important part of arriving in a new place.
Yeah, absolutely. They should be allowed to. I mean, I think they should be allowed to work while they wait. But that's a whole other discussion. But I'm sorry. I think the thing of letting members of the public decide is batshit insane. I mean, like it's like you said. People are fleeing genocide. They're fleeing conflict. They're fleeing religious persecution. They're fleeing all kinds of really complicated things that need an expert appraisal.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I take it back. It was just a kind of outpouring of, this mad optimism I seem to have. Let's move on to our next story. It's been a very busy week in UK politics. The Prime Minister resigned and his successor began to prepare to take over the top job. As a result, we haven't yet been able to report another of the country's biggest political scandals in years, and it's a grim one. It's been 8 days since the former leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, Jeffrey Donaldson, was found guilty of child sex abuse. A court heard that the politician had abused 2 victims while they were children, raping one while she was primary school age. His wife, Eleanor Donaldson, was deemed unfit to stand trial on mental health grounds, so she could not be found guilty. She faced 5 charges, 4 of which involved aiding and abetting her husband's historic sex offences, and was found to have done the acts. That's a special category reserved for people unable to stand trial. Now, these are truly, truly shocking crimes, and questions have arisen, quite rightly, over whether the DUP could have done anything about them, could have known about them, and that's especially since there have been further revelations about Donaldson's conduct, which show a long history of inappropriate behaviour that some in the DUP appear to have known about. Following the trial, the BBC aired a documentary called Politician, Predator and Paedophile. This was one of the revelations it contained.
Just as we walked up to it, I became aware of a male literally a few feet in front of me. I was 100% sure it was Jeffrey Donaldson. He paused briefly at the door of the gay sauna and then walked in. And I can't use the word that I used, but we were both stunned that he would be going in there to a gay sauna. And just to be absolutely clear here, somebody's sexuality has their own business. But I think it's the whole, if you like, history of DUP. They're opposed to gay marriage. They've always had that angle, that bigotry towards members of the gay community. And it just, that's where the shock came from, that there could be such a double standard. I find it incredible.
In 2006, the same year that he was spotted entering the gay sauna, Donaldson told the Northern Ireland Assembly this: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all teach that homosexual practice is sinful. It is a sincerely held view by Christians and people of other faiths. Senior police and politicians told the BBC they had seen Donaldson drinking heavily, despite the Unionist MP cultivating a reputation as a pious teetotaler. This included a time where Donaldson threw up all over a foreign politician.
Former DUP MP Ian Paisley was on that trip to Beijing in the mid-2000s, when he says Donaldson started drinking heavily.
On a trade mission on the other side of the world, in Beijing, getting so blindingly drunk that he actually projectile vomited over the mayor of Beijing. I was like, what on earth? So those things were happening, but I mean, that's not criminal to be not able to hold your drink and all the rest of it, but to have this pious hypocrisy. There was those certain glimpses.
Now, former and current members of the DUP have admitted they knew of allegations against Donaldson, but did nothing.
It is clear that there are a number of individuals, either former members of the Democratic Unionist Party or current, who did indicate publicly on Friday that they had information. Information that they did not share, information that was not reported through our appropriate channels, and therefore information with which we could do nothing formally about.
The party has said it's going to set up an independent inquiry to investigate their handling of the case, but opposition figures say that isn't good enough. This was Saoirse Eastwood, an Alliance MP who took on Donaldson's seat when he was arrested in 2024, speaking to The Guardian. It is not tenable for the DUP to be hiring those who will be investigating extremely grave allegations against their former party leader. Jeffrey Donaldson has been heavily involved in the politics of Northern Ireland for more than 40 years, joining the Ulster Defence Regiment at 18 and serving as an aide to Enoch Powell while he was MP for South Down. Donaldson was knighted in 2016 and was in the Privy Council from 2007. He was made leader of the DUP in 2021, pledging to create a stable and united Northern Ireland. 5 years later, stability and unity seem a very long way off. Some commentators have described the Donaldson's case as the biggest scandal in the DUP's history. Wallace Thompson, a founding member of the party, told the BBC this: "It's almost like a nuclear explosion in political terms." Thompson added that former leader Ian Paisley would be turning in his grave. Donaldson will be sentenced in September. The Belfast Telegraph reports that he is expected to appeal. Barry, does the DUP have a future after the Donaldson case? And can unionism survive this scandal?
Well, I think the DUP are in an incredibly difficult position. I'm glad you read out there the extent of his career and the extent of his importance within sort of Northern Irish politics. This is a huge figure. This is a hugely significant figure, not just now, but for, the last 30 years, coming through the Ulster Unionist Party into the Democratic Unionist Party, becoming leader of the DUP, et cetera, et cetera. This is a major, major figure, which is why I don't think that quote about it being a nuclear explosion in Northern Irish politics is, hysterical. I think that's kind of spot on. And Northern Ireland has been absolutely horrified by this case, firstly. And I'm going to read out something from The Guardian because I think people should understand how horrific this was. As you said, the identity of the two now women is being protected. So they're referred to in this article as Complainant A and Complainant B. Complainant A said she was of primary school age when Donaldson began to be physical with her and grope her chest. He used a light to look at her genitals and on another occasion kissed her and put his tongue in her mouth, she said. She recalled having nightmares about, quote, men doing horrible things to children. Complainant B said the rape happened while she was of primary school age. I remember being really still and all I could hear was his breath. The memory of the assault endures. She told the court, quote, what happened that night will live with me forever. Now that's all being reported in Northern Ireland and people are apoplectic about it, rightly. And now on top of that, you have these revelations that Jeffrey Donaldson, while one of the most powerful men in Northern Ireland, was living this double life, you know, where firstly, I want to say, as the person said in one of those interviews that you just showed a clip from, his sexuality is absolutely his own business. And any infidelity is between him and his wife. And, you know, even the drinking, again, you know, it's not usually in the public interest to report these kind of things, but it is in the public interest when this is a man who led a party that is, you know, effectively a party that's built on a sort of conservative Protestant fundamentalism, you know, by many measures, the most extreme party on social issues in the UK, you know, Northern Ireland is ostensibly in the UK. You know, and people have frequently criticized its kind of what many people call religious extremism. And the reason why it's so hypocritical is because the DUP fought hard against LGBTQ plus rights for years and fiercely tried to resist the introduction of gay marriage in Northern Ireland. And this is pre it being legalized in 2020 in the UK. And Robinson himself, even when you look back on his history, you know, he frequently called homosexuality sinful, right? There was a notorious incident in, I can't remember exactly when, but it was a DUP member called Iris Robinson said that homosexuality was an abomination. And she said that gay people could come to her and she would give them counseling and cure them. Jeffrey Donaldson defended her. He went out to bat for that woman, all the while he was living a double life as a gay man also. And so, look, you have the horrific sexual abuse, and now you have this live issue, right? Because the DUP can always say, DUP politicians can say, well, of course we didn't know about the sexual abuse. But what is being reported in Northern Ireland very, very convincingly, and what many people are coming out and saying is half of the province knew what was going on with the double life. Most of the DUP knew. Nearly every journalist in Northern Ireland knew. And so there are questions now about how the DUP allowed its leader to behave in one way and then present himself and the party in another way. It's almost like he was like the world's original grifter. You know, it's so odd and it's so dishonest. And, you know, I think there's another key thing here, which is that there is reporting now that suggests that another woman, not one of these two women who the case was about, but another woman approached members of the DUP to make a complaint about Donaldson's behavior, but said that she didn't want to make it formal. And guess what? They didn't do anything. So now, as you said, they're undertaking this internal review. I don't think that's going to be enough to save them here. Not even close. And by the way, they've had scandals in the past, and they've undertaken internal reviews in the past, and absolutely nothing has happened. So look, what we could be looking at here is a redrawing of the unionist political map in Northern Ireland if the DUP can't recover from this. And that will be quite significant. That will be hugely significant because the DUP has been the biggest unionist party in Northern Ireland for quite a long time now. And usually in polling, they poll about 10% more than the Ulster Unionist Party, which is the second biggest unionist party in the province. That's also tends to be how it shakes out in assembly elections. So it's a big gap. I mean, 10% is a big gap. But a lot of analysts in Northern Ireland now are saying, that's all about to be upended, and the DUP are going to have a really, really hard time recovering here.
I mean, I think they've got to be finished, right? I mean, they are just going to be known as the Democratic Unionist pedos. That's it. That's what they'll be known as. That's what people will say. And, you know, in some sense, it doesn't matter what they knew or what they didn't know, because it has turned out that they went to great lengths to protect somebody either by, not sort of, tackling him about these aspects of his hypocritical lifestyle, where he was very much in the business of other people's sexuality, and they stayed out of the business of his. But also this woman who came forward, they closed in around someone who turned out to be a paedophile. That's all people need to know, right, about that party now.
And someone who they also already knew as a shady character.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like this woman came to them and they had no idea. They thought Jeffrey Donaldson could never do anything like this. Well, no, they knew what kind of a man he was. They knew how duplicitous he was. And so I think that when this woman came forward, they surely knew that there could be truth to that. And like you said, they did nothing. You're saying you think they're finished? I hope they're finished, because they deserve to be finished. I mean,
unionism is in itself is something that, young people are increasingly turning away from in the North. There's a sort of, upswell of support for Republicans. This is only going to accelerate that, just in the concept of unionism, presumably.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that. I think unionism is still very strong, but there are certainly younger people who, on the Protestant side of the community in Northern Ireland, who are, increasingly seeing that there might be some value in reunification. And, I've spoken to friends who will tell me, older friends who have kind of like kids in their early 20s, say, or in their late teens, who will tell me, God, my kids don't give a shit about any of that. They don't care.
Quite right.
Yeah, well, absolutely, which is a sort of a bit of a hope for the future. But no, unionism isn't close to finished, but hopefully the DUP are finished.
Let's go on to our next story. If you found being stuck at home in the heatwave unbearable last week, be grateful that you weren't somewhere far worse. For just the small sum of £1,500, you could have attended the annual conference of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the ARC, in London, alongside Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, and a load of other leading lights of the right wing. ARC, described as the anti-woke Davos, featured senior UK politicians, US Energy Secretary Chris Wright, psychologist Jordan Peterson, thought he'd disappeared, and a host of representatives from the European far right. The event is funded by US fossil fuel interests, Trump donors, and anti-abortion groups. Badenoch used her speech to brand Ed Miliband as a villain who has made Britain poorer, saying this: "We need to make sure that this man should not be let anywhere near the levers of power, not the Energy Department or anywhere else." Perhaps more interesting than the demonization of the UK's Energy Secretary and potentially future Chancellor, senior officials from AI giant Anthropic used the conference to seek moral guidance from that crowd. DSMOG reports that Chloe Lubinsky, Anthropic's lead on research partnerships with the world's faith and philosophy traditions, told an audience at ARC this: "We need informed critics who will tell the labs when we're failing. And we need moral voices that the incentives cannot bend. That is why you're here. We need you to help us see what we, from inside the labs, cannot see." I have no idea what she's after there. Anthropic has looked to distinguish itself, by the way, from in the AI space, rather, as a more moral company than its rivals. The company has donated millions of dollars to politicians who support regulating the industry, and it refused a request from the US Defense Department to use its software to train lethal weapons system. So it seems odd that Anthropic should be seeking guidance from a group of wealthy far-right activists. Perhaps they're just looking outside of their comfort zone. Barry, what do you think? What are they doing there?
Give me strength. I'm going to be really cynical about Anthropic here. I don't think they're an ethical AI firm at all. And I don't think there's any such thing right now. I think that they're posturing. I think that Dario Amodei, the CEO, has always adopted this, I think, as a pose in order to make them seem different to the other companies such as OpenAI. I mean, yeah, look, for all that he says that they're different, they did strike a deal with the Department of Defense in the US. Okay, finally, they balked a little bit where they said, we don't want our tools to be used for mass surveillance, and we don't want them to be used for autonomous weapon systems. And for anyone who might not know, an autonomous weapon system is not just one where the AI chooses the target, it's where the AI decides to pull the trigger. Absolutely terrifying. So, okay, he drew the line there. And you know, to be fair, the reaction from the US government was incredibly aggressive. You know, Pete Hegseth said that they were doing it because of woke. I think he also called Amadei an ideological lunatic, and Donald Trump called him a left-wing nut job. But you know, like outside of the rhetoric, they did do something material to Anthropic, which was they registered them as a company of a supply chain risk, which means that they're barred from all military contracts and doing deals with people related to the US military and suppliers and et cetera, et cetera. That never happened to an American firm before. It had only ever happened to foreign companies. So look, it did do them some damage. But am I to believe that he didn't know what he was getting into when he signed a deal with the Department of Defense? They also have a deal with Palantir. Like, they're also working with Palantir. How ethical is that? And then when you look into their ethics a little bit deeper, you'll see the Western media will always point to things where they'll say, you know, well, Anthropic announced that it wasn't going to sell its products to any companies that were majority owned by the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or the North Koreans. Okay, great. But you're going to sell them to the US, you know, military establishment. You know, you're not drawing a line under there, although, you know, you had it. The you know, that's a little bit too far if you're, you know.
Some technical lines.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And so, look, they are involved in the arms business, and they're going to continue to be involved in the arms business. And I think the other thing that I find disturbing about Dario Amadei, you know, in line with a lot of tech CEOs, is he's starting to speak in a political way. You know, he's not speaking like a tech boss. He's starting to speak like a politician. Because when it comes to sort of his ethics and the ethics of the company, he talks about how Anthropic is going to sort of use AI to achieve robust military superiority for democracies, how he's really worried about the rise of autocracy. And the ethical way that Anthropic AI is going to be used is on behalf of democracies to fight against autocracies. Again, give me strength. I'm going to assume that Dario Amadei believes that the US is a democracy. Look at the number of people and the number of illegal invasions that the US has been involved in over the years. But, you know, more importantly, I bet Dario Amadei sees Israel as a democracy. So it's okay to sell Israel arms. It's okay to have Israel presumably use Anthropic AI if he's happy to provide it to democracies. All the while, this quote unquote democracy is carrying out a genocide in Gaza, you know. But I wouldn't go so far as to sell anything to the Russians. I mean, it's complete nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all equally terrifying. Technology is you know, so equally open to abuse from all fronts. Even as you say, that if there's like some minor technical lines with what, you know, they won't, and it's only what they won't do now. I mean, maybe the reason they're there is because they're actually really stung by that idea that they're woke. And they're sort of like, well, you know, that's bad for business, right? I wanted to do a little bit of market segmentation, which was like, well, you know, our AI is not ready to pull the trigger yet, so we won't sell this to you. But I'm going to go to these far-right conferences so that people don't mistake me for, mistake my business for a mad lefty business.
I also almost forgot, Claude was used apparently during the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Right, they used Claude.
Yes, it was.
And
yeah.
they asked Amadei about that, and he gave this really mealy-mouthed, slippery answer that was just not satisfactory at all. You know, he definitely appeared like he was not that bothered. And so again, it's like, you know, I'm ethical if I only support Western democracy. You know, which, you know, we all know how destructive Western quote-unquote democracy can be.
And we also know how bad for business being ethical can be. So yeah, that's probably the full circle there. All right, Barry, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. A reminder, tomorrow we won't be starting till 7:30 or thereabouts, depending on when the English match finishes. So come back then for another live show. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.